Minecraft biomes are populated by things called features. These are the various blocks and shapes that are used to give each biome a unique identity and resources. Patches of short grass, pointed dripstone, and trees are all examples of features that we can use to create custom worldgen. But one feature that is underrated, even by Minecraft itself, is the geode. Let me explain. To understand why geodes are so special, we need to talk about what other features the game uses and why their use cases are so narrow by comparison. The glowstone blobs that hang from the ceiling of the Nether are absolutely beautiful. They help break up the otherwise very barren and red ceiling and create a really unique light source that can be found in this dimension. This would be a very useful feature for all kinds of custom worldgen, either for custom dimensions or just to decorate regular cave biomes. Unfortunately, the glowstone blob feature type is not configurable at all. We can't change the size or shape that these glowstone blobs appear at, and we also can't change what block they're made of. So this is an example of a really unique feature that just doesn't have any real practical applications except for exactly this because it isn't configurable at all. Improving a little bit, we have these giant dripstone spikes. Unlike dripstone clusters, these generate only in the dripstone cave biome, and they are different than these giant columns that you might see in large noise caves, especially towards the bottom of the world. These are actually part of the terrain. They generate with density functions and are placed in the world during the initial terrain generation, before all of the features like ores and lava springs generate. These dripstone spikes, on the other hand, are features. They generate with the biome, and they are pretty configurable. We can change the range of the radius that the column generates at, and the search range that the feature looks for from the floor to the ceiling to determine if it can generate at all and whether it should connect or anything. We have a few kind of multiplier values to help change the bluntness or add some wind to it so it isn't just perfectly straight. However, just like with the glowstone blobs, we can't actually change the blocks that it is made of. It has to always be made of dripstone blocks, and there's no way to change that. Perhaps even more so than the glowstone blob feature, it's a real shame that this just doesn't have that little bit of extra configurability that would make it really, really useful in all kinds of custom worldgen. A classic feature that probably doesn't get the attention it deserves is the random patch feature. Random patches are responsible for a huge amount of the diversity that you see on the surface of many biomes. All of this short and tall grass, these groupings of flowers, the new bushes, and even things like pumpkin patches are all handled with random patches. And frankly, random patches are an underrated feature. They're one of the few features that can themselves place more features. So you could have a random patch that then places a group of trees all very near each other. Trees being one of the most configurable features in the game, this adds even more capability to them by allowing you to group several together to create more unique shapes. However, even though random patches are very configurable and very versatile, they don't have a broad application outside of pretty much shapes exactly like this. There's some cool things you can do with 3D random patches with things floating in the air, but the actual applications for that, the realistic use cases for that, are pretty minimal. And that brings us to what I believe is one of Minecraft's most underrated features, the geode. In vanilla Minecraft, the geode feature is used exclusively for the amethyst geodes that you see underground. And the amethyst geode itself is pretty much only used for, admittedly, these very beautiful, decorative, and very noisy blocks, as well as the amethyst shards that are primarily useful for spyglasses and tinted glass. Now that's not to say that this feature shouldn't exist. It adds some really great diversity and excitement to exploring underground. However, you may not know that the feature that these amethyst geodes use to generate is not only very configurable, but has a lot of really unique practical applications that no other feature can handle. So let's talk about them. I've prepared this nice flat world here so that we can take a look at how geodes are generated and then some unique ways in which geodes can be applied. So of course we're familiar with the standard geode. They often have a very irregular shape and very often are going to have a crack on one side that you can go on the inside of. This crack may not necessarily connect to a cave. There's no code for it to specifically do so or not do so, but because they're so large and because every geode has a crack, it's not uncommon for this to occur. Geodes are of course made of several different layers of blocks, which is what makes them stand out so much compared to the rest of the underground. We have the smooth basalt outer layer, this calcite middle layer, an inner layer that is made primarily of amethyst blocks but with some budding amethyst, and then we can have these amethyst shards growing off of them as well. Even though amethyst crystals will grow off of budding amethyst blocks naturally, the feature actually places some of these as part of its generation. Now, the first thing that makes geodes so useful and configurable is the fact that we can change all of the blocks that it is made up individually. As an example, we can change just the outer layer. So in this case, I'm using diamond blocks to represent that we've changed just that layer, but the calcite, the amethyst, and those amethyst crystals are all the same. And of course, we can do the same thing to just the calcite layer, just the inner layer like this. But you'll notice that when we do this, the budding amethyst blocks stay the same. I point this out because in each of these cases where I've changed the block to diamond block, I didn't have to do just that. Each of these layers accepts what's called a block state provider, which means unlike some features, we don't have to specify only a single block. We can have multiple blocks be selected from based on various weights or rarities. However, the geode doesn't do that for the budding amethyst specifically. I've changed the inner layer to just be this diamond block, but the budding amethyst has remained. And the reason that it does this is because the geode has the opportunity, and specifically amethyst geodes take advantage of this opportunity, to make these inner placements, as they're called, these amethyst crystals, have to generate on what are called these alternate inner blocks. And we can change just those as well. If we break that and place a new one, let's go around to find the crack. And I've replaced only the budding amethyst blocks now with these diamond blocks, and the rest is just the solid amethyst. What's really cool is we don't have to use these alternate inner blocks, or if we do, we don't have to make the inner placements only able to be placed on the alternate inner blocks. We can change it up. All of this is very configurable. And of course, we can also change those inner placements. In this case, I've just changed them to diamond blocks. Now, importantly, the inner placements do not accept a block state provider, at least not in quite the same way that the rest of the layers do. They only and always accept a list of block states, and they can't have any weights attached to them. Now, you can have just one entry in the list, which is what I have here with these diamond blocks, but if you have 2 or 3 or more, they're always going to have the same chance of spawning. However, you can have duplicates of them if you want to manipulate the odds. Now, geodes do have one more layer here that might not be obvious. It's the filling layer. Amethyst geodes just make their filling layer air, but if we place one here, you'll see that I've just filled it with diamond blocks. And this again, like everything except for those inner placements, accepts a block state provider. So you could make it a mixture of diamond blocks and air, or lava and water, whatever you want. Now, all of these geodes so far have been quite different in terms of shape and size, but the shape and size is, once again, configurable. The regular amethyst geode uses a couple of number providers, which is basically a fancy way of saying a random number selector, so it's not always the same shape and size each time. And the limits of this are pretty extreme. Here we have a pretty large geode, larger than some of these have been so far. Those ones in particular were pretty small. That one and that one way over there were relatively big, but this one is kind of in the middle, maybe at the upper end, and you'll notice that it is just about a perfect sphere. We've got just a little bit of noise shaping up this side over here. Some of that is going to vary based on its placement in the chunk, but the inside in particular is even more just perfectly sphere-like. The last thing I'll demonstrate with regular amethyst geodes before we go into some examples of custom applications of the geode feature is their unique ability to define what blocks they are allowed to replace, or more accurately, what blocks they are not allowed to replace. We'll get into what that actually means in a moment, but as an example here, I can place an amethyst geode here in the ground and say, okay, you can replace whatever you want except for air. And that allows us to create this really interesting cut-away geode where we can only see sort of this bottom half of it, quarter of it, that is embedded in the ground. If the ground were irregular, this would create a really unique shape. So we've taken a look at all the ways that geodes are configurable, but we've just been talking about them in the context of amethyst geodes. So what are some other geodes we can make? If we want to continue to use geodes to make geodes, we could do something like this. A perfectly spherical geode made of tuff we have a crack on one side that allows us to look in and see this beautiful glowing iron ore geode. So we have tuff for the outer layer, granite for the middle layer, and then the inner layer is a weighted state provider of deep slate iron ore, and raw iron blocks. And then for the shroom lights, I decided to make those handled by the alternate inner layer, though there's really no reason to do so because, as you can see, I don't have any inner placements for this particular geode. Again, sticking with geodes, we could do something like this really cool jungle geode that might be like a boulder that you find buried just under the surface in a jungle, made of cobblestone and mossy cobblestone, and then inside we have this awesome lush cave. We're using, again, cobblestone and mossy cobblestone for the outer layer. I went with dripstone for the middle layer just because I felt the color made sense. And then the inner layer is moss blocks with the alternate inner layer made of clay blocks, for which I have increased the rarity at which these occur. Now in this geode, I do have inner placements. However, if you look closely, you might spot the issue with this. This azalea plant and big drip leaf look just fine sitting on the ground, but this cave vine right here is not connected to the ceiling at all. And this azalea is just floating in midair. Unfortunately, we can't define any block predicate filters for these inner placements. Unlike random patches, these don't place a feature, they truly just place from a list of block states. And so if you're not using a block that has specifically the facing block state, then you can end up with these situations where it doesn't rotate or anything if it even could, and it just kind of can end up floating if it happens to generate against the wall. It doesn't care that there's no connection there. However, this can still create some really cool effects, and we kind of got lucky here and ended up getting 2 spore blossoms that are attached to the ceiling. That's not necessarily guaranteed, they certainly could have been on the floor like with this cave vine here. Now, of course, amethyst geodes only generate in the overworld, and both of these examples that we just talked about are also pretty overworld tied. So what if the nether got a geode? I didn't mention before, but the crack that allows you to access the interior of the geode is also very configurable. You can change the size and shape of it using a couple of values, and you can also change the rarity, the frequency at which geodes are going to have cracks. This one doesn't have one, so we'll have to break inside. After the blackstone outer layer, we have a magma block middle layer, and then the netherrack inner layer, which gives way to the air filling layer and the whole interior. For this particular geode, I decided to make the inner layer netherrack, and then the nether quartz, nether gold, and ancient debris are all that alternate inner layer. The glowstone blocks as well as the fire are the inner placements, and like before, they don't have to generate connected to the alternate inner layer, though I could make it that way if I wanted to. And of course, it's important to note that, as I've been demonstrating, geodes are uniquely capable of creating these sphere shapes that other features may not be able to. So, if you wanted to, you could use a geode to create a kind of big bulbous bush like this. This has an outer, middle, and inner layer made of oak leaves with some weighted state providers to have oak logs as a chance for basically some branches. But if we dig on inside of here, then we'll see that the filler layer is entirely oak logs. That would be basically the trunk of this bush. I made this one pretty large for demonstration purposes, but you could go slightly smaller and still get that kind of spherical shape that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get even with a custom tree. By the way, if you're enjoying the video, please remember to like and subscribe. I make all kinds of content related to worldgen like this, as well as custom structures that I'm excited to share with you. Now, besides arguably the bush, all of these have been basically just examples of using geodes to create geodes. And that's all well and good. It's great that we can make such unique and varied geodes, and we could of course change up their shapes much more if we wanted to. I made all these spheres just because they're cool, but they certainly don't have to be. But now it's time to dive into some things that you can do with geodes that don't even necessarily look like geodes. Because you can change the shape of geodes pretty dramatically, you could use them to create some really cool and dynamic cloud shapes. The ability to use the bulbous shape of geodes combined with their unique noise factor allows you to create these awesome cloud shapes that are frankly better and more performant than you might be able to do with something like a very large ore blob. Now, the downside or upside of this, depending on your perspective, is that because it's based on noise, the way the noise works is if we remove this and make another one, we're going to get pretty close to the same shape every single time because I'm generating this in the exact same spot. But if we move over here and generate another one, we're going to get a little bit of a different shape. This one happens to be quite tall, a little bit long. We can do another one over here, and this one again has this sort of branching or necking situation going on, but in a different shape, a different configuration than that last one. So ultimately, it's not really a concern unless you are using these with a place command and trying to place it in the same spot and hoping for a different result. For regular worldgen, it works perfectly fine. Something else you can do is really take advantage of the ability to have this sort of filling of air and especially have a semi-spherical shape and make craters. Naturally generating craters in the land, almost like a meteor struck here that has since eroded away or been collected. This is using just an outer layer that is a weighted state provider of dirt, coarse dirt, and stone. The middle layer is a weighted state provider of air and fire to allow for the fire to generate on the edges like this. And then the inner layer, alternate inner layer, and inner placements are all just air. You could go perfectly spherical, and I think for smaller craters, that's absolutely where you should go. But for large craters like this, I found that it works really well to have just a tiny bit of extra noise, almost like it came in coming at kind of an angle. You could go really crazy with this concept and make something like the Darvaza gas crater in Turkmenistan. That would be so sick. Borrowing a similar concept, we can do something like this to have a sort of scorched earth situation. There's a lot of flexibility you could do here to make it either look more like an infection or more like the grass or the surrounding area got really like burnt or other volcanic activity occurred. But in this particular situation, I just went ahead and had the filling made of coal blocks because it looks the most kind of like burnt or ruined type situation with a mixture weighted state provider of lava. The inner layer, middle layer, and outer layer are all weighted state providers. They all have a little bit of magma blocks that gets less common the further out you go. And the inner layer has some coal ore mixed in along with some brain and fire coral. The outer layer also has some grass mixed into the weighted state provider just to help make it feel a little bit more like it is growing into or encroaching on the surrounding terrain, rather than something like this that truly does make pretty harsh boundaries. This next one is based on an idea shared with me by Uni in the Stardust Labs Discord. She said that she has used geodes before by taking advantage of the inner placements to make coral fans more accessible. So I've borrowed the concept to make this really cool, kind of natural looking pool that is made of sand for the outer layer. And then all of the interior layers, the middle, inner, and filling, are all just water. And then we're using the inner placements to place a mixture of coral fans, kelp, and seagrass all along mostly the bottom. Since this happens to generate on the ground and can't replace air, we end up with very few situations where the inner placements are floating, just because there isn't a lot of wall for them to float on, though it certainly does happen. Personally, I believe that these examples are truly just scratching the surface of unique things that you can do with geodes. They offer a really great amount of flexibility in the blocks that they can use, the shapes that they can create, and the fact that they can be concentric like this allows for some really unique terrain to potentially be able to be created. However, now it's time to get into probably the most important thing that geodes are able to be used for today, and that is being able to replace large amounts of blocks during worldgen. This is a concept that was invented and popularized by Apollo, who gave the example of wanting to replace the lava at the bottom of the world. In the vanilla overworld, the lava that floods the caves at y-55 and below is pretty hard-coded. It's specifically tied to the sea level. We can't change what block the lava is, and we can't change if the lava generates without changing the sea level. But by placing a geode that is at the maximum size and is unable to replace every single block in the game except for lava, we can have this feature generate once in every chunk at a specific Y level, consistent Y level, so that it always replaces lava with water. The reason that it didn't do this entire lava pool is because of chunk boundaries. If I turn on the chunk borders right now, you'll see that the water that got filled here is almost entirely tied to this particular chunk, and it didn't stretch very far into this one. As a general rule, features can only expand just barely beyond the chunk that they are generating in, so that if a tree generates on the border of a chunk, then the leaves will be able to expand into the neighboring one. But it can't go super duper far because that could cause issues with performance. And so if we wanted to replace this lava pool as well, we would have to have another geode feature generate in this chunk, and reasonably probably in this chunk and this chunk too. I'm just using place commands here, so I didn't bother, and I wanted to demonstrate this behavior. In normal worldgen, this is very easy to do. We can specify that the geode feature should spawn a single time in every chunk and always at the same Y level. And for clarity, these boundaries apply to subchunks, not just chunks. So if we wanted to make the bottom of the world deeper, then there would still be lava generating at y-55 and below. We would have to have a geode generating at about that height to replace it with water, and then another geode 16 blocks below that to replace that lava with water, and so on and so forth. The result is a lot of geodes that get placed at consistent heights in every single chunk, but ultimately the performance impact is relatively negligible, especially considering that any other options we have are significantly worse. And the practical applications of this technology is not only limited to replacing the lava at the bottom of the world. You may recall that in my trees video, I mentioned that we can't configure coral, but with custom geodes, we would be able to replace those coral blocks with something like, for example, wet sponge. This gives us access to the unique shape that coral offers, but without having to be tied to those specific blocks. Now in this case, the shape ended up being just slightly irregular, and that's because I opted to not have specific and separate geodes for the individual solid blocks, as well as the coral fans and smaller coral blocks that can generate on the sides of them. Those are also hard-coded, they're separate blocks, and so we would need separate geodes to replace them with a different block. But for something like an end island, which is also hard-coded, we can use a geode feature to replace the end stone with whatever block that we want. And since it's all one block, we have a lot more control over it. So for something like this, we can replace the normal end island shape, the normal end stone, with a weighted state provider of amethyst and budding amethyst. Another feature this applies to is basalt columns. These huge pillars of basalt generate in basalt deltas, and unlike the end island, while we can change the density and size that these generate at, once again, we can't change their blocks as part of the feature natively. And so geodes become our best, if not only way, to take this feature and replace it with a block that we'd rather use it for, such as packed ice to make more unique iceberg shapes. And another example is the ice spike. Because I'm using the place command, this ice spike doesn't look quite as impressive as they would naturally, but when you're doing normal worldgen, these ice spikes can create super tall pillars with these really pointed heads on them. They're really awesome and make the ice spike biome incredibly unnerving and imposing, but once again, we can't change the block that they're made of. And so here I've used a geode feature to replace the packed ice that the ice spike is normally made of with a mixture of skulk, bone blocks, and skulk catalysts to add a little bit of depth to it. So as you can see, geodes have an incredible application that really no other feature is able to match with in being able to replace blocks that otherwise would not be configurable from other features. And while this replacement mechanic is the main way that geodes have been useful for custom worldgen, it's still a relatively new concept that is somewhat unknown except among the most active in the worldgen community. And of course, I still posit that unique shapes like these are another application for geodes that I really think has a lot of flexibility and that I hope will expand over time as more people become familiar and are opened to the light of geodes. And perhaps getting a little bit ahead of myself, naturally a nether geode like this would have blocks that you can't find anywhere else in the nether, in the same way that the amethyst geode is the only place in the overworld to find amethyst. So the hope is that once data packs get access to data-driven blocks, that will allow the geode scene to explode with all kinds of custom geodes. But ultimately, it's still my belief that geodes are a criminally underrated feature, and it's my hope that both Minecraft and custom worldgen developers will begin to use it more as we find more applications for its unique properties. If you're interested in custom worldgen and custom structures, or if you just really enjoyed this video and want to see more interesting facts about how Minecraft worldgen can be taken advantage of to create really impressive scenes and features, then please like and subscribe. I absolutely love talking about custom worldgen, and I love the opportunity to share it with more people. Custom worldgen is definitely one of the hardest parts of data pack development to get into, but it is also one of the most rewarding. So if you'd like to learn more about custom worldgen, check the description for a link to my written guide for how to get started. It is extremely thorough, and I'm always updating it with new information or to improve the clarity of some of the more difficult concepts. Thanks for watching!